Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michelle Williams, and I'm just so happy to be here sharing this space with you this evening as we embark on our anti-Asian racism panel. As you can see, I'm African American, but I consider it a high honor to join my Asian American brothers and sisters in Christ to embark upon this very important conversation. So what I'd like to ask of each of you is that you will sit back and open your hearts, open your ears and your minds, but most importantly, we want you to listen with your heart so that you can hear the stories that our brothers and sisters will share with us, and that we will receive it and embrace their stories with a heart of gratitude. I'm also honored to share this space with my sister, Joyce Tang Weinberg. She will be co-moderating this panel with me. And so I'd like to give her an opportunity to introduce herself at this time.
Michelle, thank you so much. It's really an honor to get to co-moderate with you. And yeah, as we get started tonight, I want to first thank our four amazing panelists for joining us tonight and recognize that it is not easy to decide to be on this panel to tell honest stories of pain and joy, the hard things that are being processed. And be honest about that in front of 98 people. And also, I want to thank all of you who've stayed for this important time. As we jump in, I want to share some background information that will help us in this conversation, and then also share some things to expect and kind of like ground rules. So first, I would like to share, something that I think is really important to know is that when we have this conversation about and invite AAPI voices, so Asian American Pacific Islander voices, tonight, that this label, AAPI, actually encompasses 48 different countries of heritage. And so when we say Asians in the US, that actually encompasses so many unique backgrounds. And that's something important to be aware of. Secondly, a lot of our conversation is spurred upon this need to have this conversation because of recent events that have been happening over the past full year, 12 months. And tonight, as we are taking communion, I couldn't help but think as we reflect on the suffering that Christ went through for us. I couldn't help but think of the stories I've heard over this past year, and especially this last month, about the suffering and violence that many Asians in the US have experienced as well. And so for some background here, at the start of COVID, the FBI actually warned that there would likely be a surge in hate crimes, and that ended up playing out. And particularly if you're not super aware, I do want to name some things that have been happening over the past year, including things like elderly people being pushed to the ground by random strangers, things as terrible as stabbings and verbal assaults in public, and even when someone has identified that a family or a house is, there's an Asian family residing in the house, that there have repeatedly been people throwing rocks or leaving messages in their home, and disturbing a place that should be peaceful. And so this is the sad truth of what has been happening, and something that an understanding that's important to have as we go into this conversation. So as far as questions go, you might have noticed that the chat was open up until now. I'm actually going to change the chat function so that all of you can directly message Michelle and I as hosts. If you have questions throughout the panel, please ask them. We will not have a live Q&A session at the end. However, every question is important, and we would love for you to directly message us to ask them as we moderate this time. And again, because every question is important, we will get back to you. If it is not covered in this panel, I will personally reach out to you. So when you ask a question, we may ask for your email, or if you want to get in touch, that you allow us to be able to keep in contact with you. So with that, I would love to pass it on back to Michelle to introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Want to also give you 3 purposes of this panel so that you are aware of why we are doing this panel. One reason is for our Asian American brothers and sisters in the church to feel heard and to process what's happening in our communities and around the country within the context of the church. So that's the first reason. And then for Asian voices to be seen and heard as important to the racial reconciliation conversation. It's not a one-sided conversation. It's not a one group of people. We want to make sure that all voices are being heard in this conversation. And then finally, to help the entire congregation, no matter what your racial background is, or to learn how to listen. I think it's something we all struggle with, but we're trying to sharpen that muscle of listening so that we can reflect on personal next steps and our own journey and how we can become allies and help in the ministry of racial reconciliation. So those are the reasons and the purposes behind why we are doing this panel today. So thank you again for being here with us. And now I have the honor of introducing our panelists. We will start with Hunter Uechi. Here she is with us here. And then our next panelist is Pastor Ken Sanu. I think I replaced myself, but anyway. We're trying to spotlight them so you all can see everyone. Our next panelist is Elder Brenda Ng. And then we have Popa Pratyaksa. Popa Pratyaksa. We are going to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'm gonna turn it over, and we'll start with Pastor Ken introducing yourself. Just about a 2-minute background on who you are and your, what you'd like everyone to hear or to know.
Thank you. I serve as Pastor of Global Ministries here at University Presbyterian Church. I was born in Korea, came to the United States when I was very young, about 4 years old. I grew up in California, and growing up, my parents gave me a great gift when I was in high school, which was they allowed me to go on a program for overseas Korean students in Korea. And because of that, I have a much deeper sense of pride and joy in the culture and the history and the background of Korea. So that was just a wonderful gift that they gave me.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Elder Brenda.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brenda Ng, and I live in Seattle with my husband. And we have one daughter who is a freshman in college and a golden retriever named Mango. My family background is both of my grandparents, my paternal side and my maternal side, came to the US from China. So I'm a 3rd generation Chinese American, meaning that my grandparents came and then my mom and dad were born in the United States. My dad was born in Los Angeles and my mom in San Francisco. Interesting background is my paternal grandfather. He became a Christian when he was in China, and he was disowned by his family. And when he came to the US, he became a Methodist minister and actually was kind of the equivalent of a head pastor of a Chinese church in San Francisco in Chinatown. So my dad and his brother and their family lived above the church growing up. And my grandfather was very community involved. He was sort of unofficially known as the mayor of Chinatown and also served as the chaplain of the San Francisco police force back in the early 70s. For myself, grew up in a middle-class family and went to the Oakland public schools where there was a lot of racial tension going on. I went to Oakland High, proud to be Oakland High alumni, but it was very different from the community here in Seattle. It was 70%, 80% African American, maybe 12%, 18% Asian, and then just a couple of single percentage points of white. And so what I experienced growing up was racism between groups within the Asian communities, as well as between different ethnic groups. And so that was not fun at all. My husband is a immigrant from Hong Kong, and very different story. So it's almost like this difference between two different cultures. But in a very short thing is his family was quite wealthy. And to give you an idea, each of the kids had their own nanny, but then they lost everything. And that true American story came over with basically going from abundance to nothing. And they lived in, the first place they lived in was in the Rainier Valley, and he went to the public schools in Seattle. Just to highlight sort of like racial differences was when he came over, I think when he was about 12, and he was taking a spelling test, and he got marked wrong for two words. He wrote the word color, COLOUR, and the British spelling for airplane, he spelled it like aeroplane. And the teacher nope, it's wrong. This is not correct. And even back then, in terms of just awareness of other cultures and spelling, et cetera. And then our daughter, who's now a freshman in college. So we've had conversations with her because her background is very different. She grew up here in Seattle, was born here in Seattle. And instead of going to public schools like her parents, we decided to put her in progressive independent schools. And so we've had discussions with her, as well as myself with my family, in having the talk and having her aware of being Asian and being a minority and being a female in our society, and in a way to help prepare her for here in Seattle and now before she went off to college. So I'll get into that more later, but that's kind of our background.
Thank you so much. Popa.
Hi, everybody. My name is Popa. So I live in Seattle. My story is a little all over the place. So I was born in Indonesia and lived there till I was about 8 years old, and then moved to the Philippines and grew up in the Philippines pretty much from 8 years old till I graduated high school. And my sister and I came to the US for college. She went to California, and I ended up in Atlanta, Georgia for a number of years for college and grad school, and then lived in Washington, DC for a number of years, and then I'm here. So this is, the reason why I moved here is because my sister and her family, husband and two daughters, they live down in Tacoma, and I've just been trying to kind of consolidate our families, and thought that it would be good to move to the same state as they are. And so, yeah, now I'm here. I've experienced a lot of different cultures. So.
Thank you. Now we have Hunter.
I'm Hunter, and I am an intern at University Presbyterian Church, and I specifically work with the university ministries and work with the worship team and the media and design team. and I am originally from Hawaii. I grew up there and I moved to Seattle for college in 2016. So I just graduated last year in the pandemic. So that was fun. And and my family background is both Asian American and Pacific Islander. My dad is Okinawan, so his family is from Okinawa. And my mom is Chamorro. So that means that her family is from Guam, and she was actually the first person to move to one of the United States because Guam is a US territory. And a lot of college students don't know that. And it's quite sad how many people just don't know about the different territories that the US has. And just getting to know, just navigating a lot of my life of being two different cultures and trying to, and both of these cultures have very different values of the honor and respect is both very prominent in both, but the way that honor and respect is shown in each culture is very different. And on my mom's side, it's very much more outgoing. And then on my dad's side, it's very much more subtle and subdued. So as you can probably infer, there was a lot of headbutting in my family of what's right and what's wrong. But I learned from a very young age that one culture is not right and one culture is wrong, but that there's a middle ground a lot of the time, and there's that gray area. So that's what I'm bringing to the table of getting to, of having navigated that. And especially growing up in the majority in Hawaii and then moving to Seattle, it was the first time that somebody actually told me, hey, you're a person of color. And I was like, what does that mean? What do you mean I'm a person of color? I looks like everybody. I mean, I guess I'm brown, so I guess I do have some color, but a lot of the time I just associated like, oh, person of color, that's a Black person. Like that's always been my mind. And for the first time, someone assigned that role to me that, hey, you're a person of color, and and that in our world means that you're othered. And that was a very odd experience of not having grown up with that identity, but it being placed on me at a very transformative age at 18. So I've been navigating what that looks like as well.
Thank you all so much for sharing such beautiful and rich introductions already. And we got all 6 of us on the screen. Let's figure it out. I would love, the next question I'd like to ask is, all 4 of you have already started to share a bit about your immigration stories. And I would love to hear with being in these 2 cultures, you carry cultures, but you're also living in specific cultures. Could you share with all of us something that brings you a lot of joy and pride about your heritage culture, as well as something that's been a struggle in balancing or being in multiple cultures? And we'll start off with Brenda for this question.
Okay. Well, I think hopefully you heard some of the pride I had in my grandfather, which was really pretty cool. I would say on some of the struggles, I would say definitely being so my background professionally is I moved to Seattle for a job opportunity in technology. And so my specific area in my career is within marketing and research in marketing. And so I would, in the area of my own personal experience, being female in the tech world is a minority. Being an Asian female is sort of the double part of that. And it's been something where I think probably the best way would be to share just experiences and let those incidents share themselves. And I think, and then I'll actually tie it to sort of what does this mean in terms of generationally, how's my daughter experiences too. So I was on a business trip in Atlanta, actually. This was probably about 20 years ago. And I was in a cab on the way to the airport to come home, and the cab driver said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from Seattle." "No, where are you really from?" I said, "Well, I was born in Oakland." And he goes, No, what country are you from?" And so just And so I talked to him. I said, well, my ancestors came from China, but I'm from the US. He goes, you don't even have an accent. And it was just one of those things where I see some folks nodding because you've experienced this, but just because of how I look, the assumption is I am not from this country. I'm from an overseas country. And so I just had a nice conversation with the cab driver. But what's interesting is that conversation still happens today. So I was discussing with my daughter that I was very excited to be on this panel, and it kind of opened up some questions, and I asked her, and we've had discussions over her lifetime of 19 tender years of being prepared and experiencing racism. What does this mean? And especially with all the recent episodes that have been having much more awareness in the last year in our country. And so when we she goes to a school, it's a small liberal arts school just outside of Philadelphia, and they test their kids, the students and staff for COVID. And just in the last 2 weeks, she goes, oh, well, that's interesting, because I forgot to tell you that when I was being tested for COVID, and this wasn't the school, but they bring a third party on to test students. I'm sure many of you have been tested. So when they're putting, the vial and doing the test, they said, oh, what's your full name? So I can, label it correctly. So she says, and she said I could share this story. My name is Erin Ng. And so the lady writes it down, and she says, well, what's your real name? And she goes, Erin Ng. And she says, well, don't you normally have 2 names as part of your name, which is in the Chinese or many Asian languages, is like, you could be like, like Lurong Duck would be like 2 names, right? And so she says, no, that is my full name. And then she realized that this woman did the same thing that would happen to me 20 years ago, that just because my daughter had these Asian features, that she must not be from the United States. And then she shared, and the interesting thing was the person who was giving me the test, she spoke with a British accent. So she's probably not from the US. So I'm making light of that, but I'm just more illustrating that is something that still goes on in the next generation in 2021.
I can go next. So in terms of joys and pride from my family heritage, one thing that was really hit home for me when I learned more about Korea is the fact that Korea has 5,000 years of history. That just blew my mind because, the United States has 250 years or so, right? So that was an amazing discovery for me to realize the richness of the culture, the history. Another thing is I'm very proud of Korean food. I like food anyway, but Korean food is awesome. So if you haven't had Korean barbecue, that's the way to go. But some of the struggles of being in multiple cultures, I actually grew up in Oakland, the same as Brenda. I went to a different high school. My high school was a little bit, at the time, was a little bit more integrated in terms of probably 40-something% white, and then the rest, a mixture of African-American, Asian, whatever. But what was interesting to me growing up in that was racism was always taught and portrayed as a black and white issue. So I never knew what does that mean for me. And then what was interesting was I was the brunt of racist attacks from individuals who were white, who were black, who were, so I seemed to get it from all different sides. But one thing I learned from that was that that it was always individuals. It was never the whole group. I had really good friends who were white, who were black, or Asian, Hispanic, whatever, and many of them, stood with me. So that's one thing I learned, was that when I was on the receiving end of racist attacks, it was always from individuals. It wasn't from the whole group. And so I was very blessed. I was fortunate to have really good friends who stood by me from every ethnic group that was around.
Pastor Ken, I'm so glad you said food. I was going to say the same thing. Asian food and also Japanese food is so good. And if you folks have a chance to try Chamorro food, oh, it's so good. Lots of barbecue. Very good for this weather. So that's definitely a joy and pride. And just for me, a lot of struggles is trying so hard to assimilate into the dominant culture, just so that I don't get called out or made fun of. Because my hair is more blonde, if that's not already a way of assimilating. But also, like, some of my friends I have a lot of white friends that I've made at Seattle U, and some of them have told me to my face, like, oh, sometimes I just forget that that you don't look like me. And part of that, in a way, it hurts. And even though it seems like that would be the thing that I'm aspiring to be, but in not being seen for being a little bit different than them, it kind of just means like, oh, part of them doesn't see what I look like on the outside, which is also informs a part of the inside of me. And the way that I go through the world and the things I feel on the inside have a lot to do with how people treat me because of what I look on the outside. So in them not seeing that, it definitely is a struggle of where the line is of trying to assimilate so that I am safe, but also trying to really find joy and pride in my culture and honor that, because there have been so many things that people before me have gone through and sacrificed so that I can be here today.
Yeah, for me, definitely the food. I think a personal heritage and family that I'm proud of is, if you guys are not aware, Indonesia is a majority Muslim country. And so my maternal grandfather, actually became a Christian first and was disowned by his family. And I never met him. He passed away a few months before I was born, and actually I was named after him. But yeah, that's something that I hold pretty dearly. But then to kind of build on that, I mean, the struggles, I've also experienced some of the similar things that some of the others mentioned, like people asking me where I'm from, or actually somebody came up to me in the grocery store in Atlanta asking me, what am I? Or again, as if it was some like special thing, why don't you have an accent? So things like that. But I would say more of the struggle is about, I guess this is a good thing and a bad thing. I think that I'm able to fit in many different cultures, having, obviously ethnically I'm Indonesian, but I have a lot of Filipino friends that I can, kind of fit in and understand their culture. Obviously, having been here for so many years, I understand that culture as well. But so that's the good side of it. But on the other side, not really fully belong to any culture, I would say. Even though I can relate to all of them, I know that I'm not fully any one of them, because I left Indonesia at such a young age. My Indonesian's pretty basic. I can talk to my parents in Indonesian and some of my friends, but I can't write a book or write an essay, and my Indonesian's not that good. So it's just kind of feeling like you not fully belong to any of the cultures that you have been a part of would be a struggle.
Thank you all for sharing your stories with us, a little bit of your background. I want to move the conversation a little bit to some current events. What happened in the shooting in Atlanta we will all agree was just horrific and shocking and saddening. And we had so many feelings and emotions about it. However, we recognize that this is just one event out of many that happen and have been happening, particularly over this last year. And so what I'd like to ask is, I mean, it's been happening against the elderly and women. So I just wanted you guys to share how you feel, what impact this has had on you and your family. How are you processing this? What are you struggling with? And what do you make of it?
Well, I have to admit that I hesitate to share this because my emotions are so raw. And I feel like, I'm a pastor, so I want to be careful in what I say and how I say. But as a pastor, I also know what's in the Bible. And what's in the Bible, one particular passage stands out to me, and that is Psalm 137. Psalm 137 is a psalm that talks about the anguish of the people of Israel who were in exile in Babylon. And they are treated so badly by the Babylonians that the psalm ends in a very, very shocking manner. The psalm ends by the psalmist saying that he basically wants to see the Babylonians' babies dashed against the rocks. That is just a horrific image, right? But I think it's important that it's in the Bible because it really portrays the anguish, the raw emotions that the people of Israel were feeling at the time. Now, I want to be very careful here, okay? And I want everyone to really clearly understand me. Number one, the psalm is not advocating that people go out and do that action. That is not what it is saying. What it's saying is, this is how I feel. That's very important. And that's the way I find myself in right now. I am not advocating violence. Please understand that. But I am feeling a tremendous sense of raw anger and just, first of all, those who are perpetrating these racist actions, number one, they're just wrong. They are going against God's will. God's will is not for us to go out and attack people because they're different ethnicity from us. That's number one. But number two, as I'm looking at many of these attacks against the elderly, against mothers with young children, against unarmed women and people with guns going against them, what I see is I see cowardice. These are cowards for people for going and attacking people like this. And for that, I have just, my culture is such that you show tremendous respect to your elders. You take care of your families, your children, and to see them attacked really gets me so angry. Now, again, that's how I feel. Now, what I do with those feelings is going to depend on how God wants me to take those raw emotions and act. And I know that God does not want me to go out and engage in violent acts against these perpetrators. So please understand, I'm being very clear about that, but that's how I feel right now. And the final thing about it is, it really hit home to me when I heard from my daughters that this is the first time that they can remember feeling afraid, feeling fear about going out. And when I hear that from my daughters, my protective fatherness comes out, and I just want to just kind of protect them, shield them, and go after these people. I'm not going to do it, but that's how I feel.
Uh, Actually, I would like to share, but I was actually curious, Brenda and Hunter, if you wanted to share first, because the victims of this tragedy were Asian women. So maybe you guys can kind of share how you feel or think too first.
Sure, thanks. I feel afraid, just to answer the question. And it wasn't just this particular tragic event. I could feel and hear it coming from way before this actual event. This is hopefully not, like the only culmination, but as soon as our previous president, he was calling things like the China flu, and just when he started saying that, I just knew, like, oh boy, here it comes. Like, I just knew that was sort of like unleashing, taking the top off of Pandora's box. And like I've said, we've had conversations with our daughter before, and we had to start conversations more when that kind of rhetoric was coming from not only that political leader at the time, but any political leader, any person in a role of power. And so we definitely, when she was getting ready to go off to college, explained to her that in going to the East Coast, it's culturally, just being on the East Coast is different. I've lived in New York City for a couple of years. So just trying to help prepare her to that, just difference to the East Coast culture versus West, but then also letting her know that we don't know what the mood is over there, but just talking about a lot of sort of what we consider basic things to be aware of, to be prepared for. And sometimes even if you are, you're never really prepared when it actually is happening in real time.
I'm also afraid, but it's just being in a new place is without family is always a little bit scary. And kind of what you were saying, Brenda, of like how you kind of saw this in the works before it happened. Before like I really started learning a lot more about Asian American culture in the continental US. I studied abroad in Italy for a couple months, and I studied in a very small town where they actually were very racist. And it was the first time that I just experienced completely not being acknowledged, like not even being looked in the eyes. And it was very dehumanizing of, oh wow, like people get treated like this all the time in America. And that's scary. And it just made me sad that that was the first time that I actually realized that, wow, I've had the privilege of never having to experience this in my whole entire life until this moment. And that makes me happy that I didn't have to experience that, but also, again, very sad because that's a thing that people have dealt with for their entire lives. And it does make me a little bit angry too, because why does that even exist? And so it does make me upset. And it was also one of the first times where I got followed, even though I was also simultaneously ignored. So that's just very confusing. Of being safe doesn't actually like mean, or being ignored doesn't mean that you're safe still. So it's scary because it's very confusing, and there's no safety. And no matter if I do exist and benefit from being invisible, it's still, there's still a lot of fear.
Yeah, in terms of the Atlanta tragedy, what happened there, I have been wrestling with a lot of thoughts and feelings. I mean, personally, I have a personal connection to Atlanta, having lived there for 7-8 years, and I have a lot of friends out there who are Asian. And, you know, when I checked in with them, they were telling me that they were afraid of, maybe they were telling me that, you know, this, like similar to what you guys were saying, that this was the first time they feel like their lives were actually threatened. And they were also afraid of maybe going to Asian groceries or any places that, you know, just had a big Asian population. They wanted to avoid those areas, which is sad that, you know, this had an effect on people's just trying to live their daily lives. But, you know, on top of that, I feel like there are a few things that have been making me feel, I don't know how to describe it. I guess just disturbed and sad, but also kind of an acknowledgement that I have some responsibility to speak up about it. And these few things are, I don't know if you guys have read into detail about like the motives of the shooter, but from what I've read, um, you know, he had a Christian background. I'm not sure, maybe he was a pastor's son or something like that, but there was definitely a link to, you know, a church background, and he was struggling sexually. He had a sexual addiction. And so the stories that I've read have made it seem like he was acting out to kind of get rid of the sources of his sexual addiction, which I think is very disturbing. And so just as I was reflecting on what happened, I think what I see are intersecting areas of brokenness. One is that there's definitely an element of misogyny and degrading views of women, right? And to add to that, which is where the race thing comes, is the historical stereotypes and sexualization of Asian women. And even where the shooting happened, in Asian spas, as if, you know, Asian spas are the places you go to, I don't know, maybe get your lust, you know, met or whatever. Like that's, I don't know, it's just, it's just been a lot. And so there's misogyny, there's the sexualization of Asian women. So you can't take the race out of it, because clearly the majority of the victims were Asian women of Asian descent. And then there's the whole connection with the church and his sexual addiction. And, you know, that just made me think about how we've seen over and over men try to blame their sexual desire, sexual struggles on women, and how they talk, how they dress, how they walk. When in reality, you know, we as men need to own up to our struggles. We can't control how women dress, talk, or walk. We need to own up that this is something that we struggle with, and not put the blame on other people. And I think that going back all the way to Genesis has been a thing, right? Putting the blame on somebody else. And to add to the whole sexual addiction thing, it just also made me kind of wrestle with this, I guess how the church, or how we've been teaching our young people how to deal with sexual addiction or sexual sin in general, and how that's always been, you know, kind of shameful. We don't really talk about it. And a lot of the rhetoric out there is always focused on achieving or striving for the behavior. And, you know, even as during the Lent season when I was following the booklet that we got. I think one of the passages there, I think from Galatians, got me thinking a lot. It spoke about the fruits of the Spirit and how if we live and walk in step by the Spirit, being led by the Spirit is producing fruits in our lives, one of them being self-control related to sexual addiction. And I just, I don't know, I've just been wrestling with whether we're focusing too much on, are we chasing after the fruits too much? Are we chasing after the behavior too much? Instead of chasing after God and seeking after God and walking in step with the Spirit and depending on the Spirit to produce those fruits that we want in our lives. And so, yeah, I just feel like there's so many intersecting layers of brokenness that was represented in that tragedy, and it's just a lot. and yeah, it's just some of my thoughts.
Thank you all so much for responding to that question. I think it's a hard question to talk about your feelings, and this next question will continue to ask you to do that. So I just want to take a pause and just say thank you to our panelists for being honest with all of us tonight. This next question is really about our experiences in church and spaces of faith. And all of us here can agree that as Christians, we see that the way that God loves us is God sees us fully and wholly as we are and loves us with our cultural identity, all the identities that we hold. However, as humans and humans interacting in faith spaces, we're not always able to meet the standard that how God loves all of us. So starting with Popa, actually, back to you, could you share with us a time in a faith space where you felt like you weren't fully seen because of your AAPI identity, recognizing like there are also other layers of identity that you hold. But in that situation, how did you feel?
I feel like for my own experience, based on my own experience and background, I think it's very hard to actually isolate feelings of being othered, and whether those were caused by my API identity. Let me just say, I guess in general, and I guess there's a pretty big caveat because of my background and where I've been and all these different countries that I've lived, right? In any church setting, I guess I've never really felt like I was I guess really represented or have met just, I mean, it really relates to going back to that feeling like I don't belong in all these different cultures, fully belong. But I guess in a church context, for example, like in Atlanta, I attended a church, a small church near the campus of the university that I was going to. And, that was predominantly white, and, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just the makeup of that church. And I found it easy, I guess, to just kind of slip in and out and not really be noticed, or also in a selfish way, I guess I used it as a reason to not get involved more, because I never really saw anybody that looked like me, or not many of them at least. And then I also attended a church that was just an Indonesian congregation. And in that setting, even then I felt like I didn't fully fit in, because in Indonesia, there's so many different subcultures. There's so many different people groups, and the nature of the Indonesian church in America, they're made up of predominantly Indonesians that are of Chinese descent, and so there's some differences there, even though we share a lot of similar values and experiences and background, but there were also newer things that I had to learn and now I'm more familiar with. So again, so I'm just trying to make a contrast of, like, in one setting, it was like that. In another setting, which, one might think it might be different, it was like this. And even in a church setting where they were really striving to be multicultural, which was good. Even in that setting, I was probably the only Indonesian in that congregation, probably one out of maybe 2 or 3 Southeast Asian in that congregation. And I guess I would add that, like, the way that I feel and perceive these things, I understand that they are really influenced by my background and my experiences, right? Maybe somebody with a similar background as me, but have different experiences, might perceive things differently. So I know that there's a caveat there, and definitely it's not the fault of any of the churches or any other congregations that I felt that way. I guess it's a very convoluted kind of feeling. But I guess I just wanted to share that in my experience in many different church settings, I still didn't feel like I was really a part of that. Yeah.
I have a kind of a quick example of not being seen in a church setting. So I was serving on one of the committees on session, and as the time for that committee, it's usually we meet around 5:30 or so. So this is before COVID, so people were arriving sort of, into this conference room, and one of our fellow elders, older gentleman, and said, "Oh, hey, Brenda, I didn't hear back from you. I sent you an email, but I didn't hear your reply." And I was like, "Oh, really?" I'm usually so on top of it in terms of trying to be pretty prompt. I said, "What email was that?" And he goes, "Oh, the one about the facility," and start going about to it. And then at Suco, one of our executive directors, who's phenomenal, arrives, and I realized he must have probably sent it to Atsuko, and he thinks he's talking to Atsuko right now. So I deliberately put my backpack next to Atsuko so I could sit down next to her. So when he's talking to me, there's actually 2 Asian females that he's actually seeing. And I said, maybe, did you mean to send that to Atsuko? But I'm Brenda. And so we worked it out, but it's more of an example where it's totally innocuous. It was not bullying. It was it was totally unintentional. And it was more almost humorous from that perspective, in the sense of, we're all serving, none of us are perfect. And then I have to share too, because I think Pastor Aaron's on the call. So I've made the same mistake myself. So this was, at the beginning of session, we're getting our dinners at the time, and I say hello, and it's Pastor Aaron, and I call him somebody else's name, and I was mortified. And so I myself have made the same mistake, and I just wanted to shrink into nothing for that. I apologize, and I still feel bad to this day, but so it happens to all of us.
I have to say that I think because of my my background and my training and my experience and my education, I've gone through, you know, Presbyterian seminaries and so on. And because of the role that I have, I really, fortunately, have not experienced very many times when I haven't been seen or heard. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I have the credentials, and that's kind of interesting. I think in a lot of ways that you know it puts me in a strange position of having those advantages. So yeah, that's where I am.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I want to speak to those of you who are listening. Again, feel free to send a question if you have it. We're nearing the end of our conversation. This is the last question that we will be asking. And so if you do have questions, feel free to send them in the chat, and Joyce will be fielding those. Not sure that we will have the time to get to them, but we will address them at a later time. We will follow up. So just as we round this corner and thinking about your experience in the church, I just kind of want to ask the question as a person of Asian American descent, Pacific Islander background, what is something that your Christian brothers and sisters can do to include and recognize you as who you are, valuing your background, your culture, your race, ethnicity, just valuing you, not overlooking it, but what is something in the church that you feel or you would like to see happen towards you from your brothers and sisters in Christ? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I could start with this one. So for me, it's really important that it's a both and in the university ministry, you talk about that a lot, that I would like to be seen for my culture, but also not only seen for my culture, that it's a part of who I am, but I'm also Jesus follower. I'm also a woman. I also have so many other hobbies and activities that I love to do that make up me. And another thing just that I noticed, because I'm 23 years old and 23-year-olds use a lot of Instagram and social media to do their advocacy work and support people. However, when this happened, so many of people on my team, because I work on the team, and just peers, they posted on Instagram just I think a lot of it was from the Black Liturgist Instagram account, which is really great. And it said, I see you and I hear you. And yet nobody actually came up to me in person. And we were on an intern retreat, so they could have came up to me in person and asked me, hey, how are you doing? And that would have been so human. And honestly, I think that's what Jesus would have done, would have been to actually like go up to me and say, hey, like, I'm here with you and I see you and I want to hear what's happening. And I want to move from that bystander position of just seeing and hearing you and become an active participant. And that's what I actually need, because I don't know if you can tell, but I am pretty good at advocating for myself. So the best way that I can be loved well by my brothers and sisters in Christ is actually being advocated for, because I have the ability to advocate for myself, but it does get tiring being the person that's the voice for the minority. And it's a minority for Asian Americans and people of color and women, and constantly being the person of saying, hey, I don't think that's right. Like, it gets tiring And I feel like a broken record, and I feel like it's not as impactful because I'm always the person that's saying something. But then at the same time, I know that it is so worthwhile to say something, and that this nudge on my heart is not just me speaking for myself, but it's like, oh, actually, no, God has prompted me to say something because it's not right. And it's so difficult because I do not want to speak out, but I know that that's a part of being a Christian, is sometimes you're prompted to be uncomfortable and go into the unknown. And so I also want to invite others to step into that with us, because I'm often in that space.
I have two things I'd like to share. The first would be how I would love to see folks stepping up as an ally with other, not only Asian American AAPIs, but also other ethnic groups, all ethnic groups. And actually, has anyone here ever taken a self-defense class? Because you are never too old or young to take one. I took a self-defense class when I was single as a female. And then my daughter and I took it together before she went off to college. You could sort of see this theme of preparing her for college. And one of the core things that they teach you is to visualize what you might do in a situation. So if you're walking to the car at night, you know, what are some things that you can do? You might bring a friend. What would you do if a person was coming? You have like your keys out. Where would you run? What would you do? I mean, just often sports, they do the same thing. How do you visualize making that basket? How do you visualize? And that helps you save those nanoseconds of when something happens, you can be faster to react. And that could be something similar that can be applied to if you see someone who's being bullied verbally or physically, or someone who's ignored. How can you be the welcoming person, whether it's in a church setting or in a non-Christian setting? This is where, how can we be the Samaritan to other folks, and stepping in, whether it's, there's a lot of verbally, it could be an invitation. It can also, there's a lot of different actually things. NPR had a good section on that, what you can actually do. But I think just visualizing, what would you do if you saw a friend at a dinner party, or coming to church when we gather again, or at a grocery store, being treated a certain way or ignored? What can you do in those situations? The second thing I would offer would be kind of a message of hope, because Christ is our role model from this. And this is actually a example from, I guess today's only Tuesday, but my daughter, we talked to her yesterday, and she got her midterm paper back. She's taking her first psychology course, and fortunately it's being taught by the chair of the department. And what was interesting was the way the professor graded the paper was, she told the students, I tried to remove as much bias as I could when I was grading this paper. And so what she did was she covered the names. So she actually printed out all of the exams, because it was done on the computer. She printed them all out. She covered the names. And when she started grading them, she graded like question 1 first by, let's say, student A. And then rather than continuing grading through the rest of the paper, she read question 1 from student B, and then so on for every single student in the class. And then she read question 2. And so there was basically removing that amount of bias from continuing within the same exam and looking at across the different students by question. Now that was very time consuming, but I think the point I'm making here is she was role modeling for the students that she can try to remove as much bias as she can, and she was willing to take those extra steps for that. And Christ has done the same for us in terms of role modeling how we should treat brothers and sisters in Christ, as well as the others from that. And we can look to him for his direction from the word, as well as in his own actions that he has given us.
And I want to follow up on what you just said, because my answer to this question, and it's going to sound like, it's coming from a pastor, and it is, but I think it's still right, is that what I wish that people would do is read their Bibles. I wish they would study their Bibles, because the more you study the Bible, the more you study about Jesus, the more you learn about God and his creation and his intent for his creation, the more you'll understand that God has created us in such a way that, our fulfillment that's talked about in Revelation is we're not going to lose our ethnic identity. Our ethnic identity is going to be fulfilled in the new heaven. And so that's what's great. And so the more people know that, the more people that understand that this is what God has in mind for us, the better advocates we're all going to be for each other. And so that's my hope, that people really, really get to know Jesus better. Read your Bible, and study it. And when people do that, the more we do that, the better we're going to be able to work on racial reconciliation.
Well, I don't think I can follow that up. Yeah. I guess I'll just add that for all of us, I guess in general, I know it's very hard to get out of our comfort zones, even for myself, right? It's very easy for me to just stay at home or not, call somebody or not text somebody or not say hello to somebody. So I would just add that, just like any other normal person, say hello or invite us to do something or include us in something. And yeah.
Thank you, guys. I wanted to jump up with a follow-up question specifically for Hunter that came from the audience. Hunter, you talked about advocating for others when you see that something isn't right. And could you give some specific examples so that our audience can be aware when those things happen and they can also try to jump in for others?
Yes, something that I can think of that's like lower stakes is thinking about different communication styles. On our staff, we often, Joy showed me this like illustration comparing speaking styles to sports. So oftentimes Western cultures, we play basketball, and that's just like you're trying to dominate, you're trying to grab the ball, steal it. I don't know basketball terms, so forgive me if that's not the right terminology. In a lot of Asian and I think it's East European cultures, they bowl. And so they take turns, they wait their turn. And as you could probably tell by tonight, like everybody waited their turn, waited a couple more seconds after someone finished talking so that someone didn't feel disrespected and everyone got to say what they wanted to say. And in a lot of African cultures or like Hispanic cultures, Latin cultures, they play rugby. So they're like, everyone's in on the action, they're running towards each other, everyone's in it. Everyone's having a conversation at the same time, and it's just joyous and fun. So that's like a low stakes thing of just recognizing that there may be other ways of communicating and that your way of communicating isn't the right way. It's just the way that you learned. And in terms of like specifically for this, we as a staff are talking about ways that we can talk about addressing our community and supporting them. And some people came up with the idea of, why don't we host events? Why don't we show a movie about the history of Asian Americans? And that just, it felt wrong. And I didn't want to say anything because I was like, they're in the right ballpark. Like they want us to learn more. But then at the same time, it's not enough to just show a history about Asian Americans and just say, hey, we did our part. We hosted an event and now we're moving on. But actually continuing the conversation is what is needed and is what is necessary, and not just saying, hey, like I did something and I checked it off my list and now I can go on with my day. I'm not racist because I showed and I talked about the history. But it's that act of being anti-racist that's actually helpful, and continuing the conversation, even if there aren't any people that are actively being talked about in the news. It's not just talking, not just showing, like if someone dies from a mental health issue, you're not just going to show a history about mental health, because that doesn't actually suffice, but actually talking about it and listening to people is gonna create so much space, and listening not to respond, but just to actually hear, because so much of our world right now is listening to respond and attack. But if we're actually just listening to learn something from somebody else, I think that could change so much. And we can start appreciating bowling, and we can start appreciating rugby and basketball, and learn that there are so many amazing skills and strategies that exist in all those different ways of playing sports.
Thank you all. You might be sitting here like I am, saying like, wow, thanks for sharing your heart. I've been moved by your stories. And you might be left saying, what now? What do I do with this? How can I be an ally? What are the next steps? Where do we go from here? Conversations like this are never answered in one setting. And so we don't expect that this will be the only setting that we will have to have conversation together. I want to encourage us to continue the conversation so that we can, as a church, can continue working towards racial reconciliation. It happens every day, all day, in all aspects of our lives. And so I just want to take a moment and say thank you to each of you panelists for sharing your heart, for being vulnerable with us, for being open with us, for sharing your story, your family, a piece of you. We will take away from this discussion with us, and we are eternally grateful. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joyce, and she's going to talk about some next steps that you might want to participate in or connect with. And she's going to close us out in prayer. So we just really thank you all for sticking with us tonight and being here this evening. Thank you so much.
Yes, I just want to echo all of that. There are so many things you can do. And if you take one thing away from this panel, it's that it's better to do something than nothing. And so we have a few resources we'd like to tell you about that are UPC specific. If you're here tonight and you identify as AAPI and you'd like to be a part of a group of other AAPI congregants and have conversations, in May, we will be having a small group specifically creating a space for that. And you can find out more on the website, I believe. The next thing is that next month, May, is actually AAPI History Month. So many of the UPC staff will be, and congregants as well, will be writing blog posts. So you can continue to learn from there. But beyond that, something that's really important is that, one, it's so important to step into relationship, right? Have these conversations with real people and people that you trust or are building trust with. And at the same time, we don't want your friend to be the Asian Google, or Google for a specific experience that's unfamiliar. So again, there are many resources online that you can just look up and learn so much. One of the ones that an audience member messaged in relates back to something Brenda talked about, which is bystander training. there's a website called ihollaback.com. I will type it out. And that's a great place to jump in and get started, and it's free. So that's something that I would also suggest. So again, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This is the start of your start of so many more steps to take in the journey. So with that, I'd love to pray for all of us and close this out. Dear holy and beautiful Trinity, I thank you so much for this time and space tonight. I thank you for each person that showed up, made space, time, and created a posture of listening to our fellow brothers and sisters. Lord, I pray that we would take what we've heard and let that combine with what you are teaching us to shape our hearts of how to show up in the world for our brothers and sisters who are in pain. We recognize that this conversation is one conversation in many other conversations where you are calling us to show up. And so, Lord, I just pray for any hearts that are feeling especially moved, or that you would give us the courage to take the next step, even right after we log off the Zoom, to do something. And even this week, that each of us would do something to dive deeper, learn more, and listen. Lord, you are a God of restoration, of reconciliation, and that is a gift and something that brings us so much joy. And so I pray that we will continue to walk with you and with each other as we learn to be more like the peacemakers that you call us to be, making peace in spaces of conflict. Jesus, we love you, and it's in your name that we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you everyone so much for coming. And I didn't type the website name, but I'll do it now. ihollaback.com. And thank you so much for coming. If you have other questions, you can reach out to staff and they can connect with others. So thank you.